Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor of the sprawling Costa estate. Basia clutched her swollen, bruised forearm against her chest, praying the oversized fabric of her maid's uniform would hide the jagged bone pressing violently beneath her skin. She was just a domestic worker, fat, entirely invisible, and utterly terrified. But when her ruthless employer, Lorenzo Costa, caught a fleeting glimpse of her muffled agony, the criminal underworld shifted on its axis. By dawn, 15 ruthless men would vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but blood-soaked whispers. Rain lashed against the frosted windows of the Q train as it rattled its way out of Queens. Basia Hughes sat heavily on the hard plastic seat, her generous frame taking up exactly a seat and a half, a fact that usually invited dirty looks from morning commuters. Today, however, no one sat near her. The smell of stale copper and damp wool clung to her, but it was the unnatural, stiff way she held her right arm that kept people at bay. Basia was a large woman. She had been overweight her entire life, a physical trait that had effectively rendered her invisible to most of the world, and a target for cruel jokes to the rest. Society had long ago decided where she fit in: the background. It was a role she had accepted with quiet resignation, especially when it landed her a high-paying job as a domestic worker at the sprawling North Shore estate of Lorenzo Costa. Lorenzo was a man whose legitimate business in logistics and import-export was merely a front for a ruthless criminal empire that controlled the eastern seaboard. In the Costa household, maids were expected to be seen and not heard. For Basia, being completely overlooked was her greatest asset, until last night. A sharp, breathless whimper escaped her lips as the subway car lurched to a sudden halt, sending a shock wave of blinding white agony up her right arm. Beneath the thick wool of her oversized winter coat, her forearm was a mangled canvas of black, purple, and sickly yellow. The bone was fractured, splintered cleanly in 2 places, the result of a brutal encounter in the narrow alley behind her cramped apartment building. It was supposed to be a simple walk home from the grocery store, but 15 men, thugs belonging to Jimmy O'Shea's low-level extortion ring, the West Side Cobras, had been waiting for her. They weren't there for her purse. They were there to send a message to her deadbeat brother, Tommy, who owed O'Shea upward of $60,000 in gambling debts. Basia had never seen a dime of that money, had barely spoken to Tommy in years, but in the gritty, unforgiving logic of the streets, blood was leverage. "Tell Tommy the clock is ticking, pork chop," one of the men had sneered, a towering brute named Mickey, just before he swung a rusted tire iron directly into her raised forearm. She remembered the sickening crack that echoed off the brick walls, the chorus of cruel laughter from the 14 other men who stood watching, smoking cigarettes, and mocking her as she collapsed into the wet garbage. They had kicked her twice in the ribs for good measure before melting away into the shadows of the city. Now, 14 hours later, Basia was doing the only thing she knew how to do: surviving. She couldn't afford a hospital visit. A police report would sign her death warrant, and Tommy's too. Most importantly, she could not lose her job at the Costa estate. Lorenzo Costa paid his staff triple the standard rate, demanding absolute perfection and unbroken routine. If she called out sick, she would be replaced by tomorrow. Arriving at the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, Basia flashed her ID badge to the armed guards, keeping her right arm tucked securely against her side. The security team barely glanced at her face. To them, she was just Basia, The quiet, fat maid who scrubbed the baseboards and polished the mahogany until it gleamed. Inside the staff locker room, the air was warm and smelled of lavender detergent. Basia struggled out of her coat, tears pricking her eyes as the movement jostled her shattered radius. She managed to slip into her uniform, a black dress with a white apron that she deliberately ordered 2 sizes too large. The extra fabric draped loosely over her right arm, concealing the unnatural swelling and the grotesque angle of her wrist. "You look terrible, Bee," muttered Sophia, a slender, sharp-tongued maid who was applying red lipstick in the mirror. "Boss is in a foul mood today. Matteo has been running in and out of the study all morning. Stay out of his way if you know what's good for you." "Just a cold," Basia mumbled, her voice thick and trembling. She tucked her injured arm against her thick waist, using her left hand to grab a feather duster and a silver polishing cloth. Her assignment for the morning was the East Wing, which included the Grand Library and Lorenzo Costa's private study. It was a daunting task on a good day. Today, it felt like a death sentence. Basia moved through the quiet, opulent halls, her soft, heavy footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs. Every heartbeat sent a throb of excruciating pain, radiating from her elbow to her fingertips. She could feel a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead, her breathing growing shallow. She just had to make it through the next 8 hours. She had to remain invisible. But as she approached the heavy oak doors of the master study, she heard the deep, rumbling voice of the devil himself. Lorenzo Costa was inside, and the door was slightly ajar. Lorenzo Costa did not get to the top of the East Coast Syndicate by being unobservant. He was a man of meticulous detail, a predator who noticed the slightest shift in the wind, the subtle twitch of a liar's eye, or the faintest discrepancy in a ledger. Sitting behind a massive desk carved from dark mahogany, Lorenzo pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long plume of smoke from a Cuban cigar. He was 38, with sharp, aristocratic features, jet black hair slightly graying at the temples, and eyes the color of forged steel. His underboss, Matteo Ricci, was pacing the length of the room. "The docks are secure, boss, but O'Shea's crew is getting bold," Matteo was saying, glancing at a tablet. "They're shaking down local businesses in Queens, stepping outside their territory. They're disorganized, sloppy. 15 guys running around, thinking they own the streets." "Leave O'Shea for now," Lorenzo replied, his voice a low, dangerous baritone. "He's a rat fighting over crumbs. As long as he doesn't touch anything that belongs to me, I don't care if he burns his own neighborhood to the ground." It was at that exact moment Basia pushed the heavy oak door open with her hip. She froze, realizing the room was occupied. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Scusi, Mr. Costa," she whispered, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I can come back." "No, clean the shelves. We're finishing up," Lorenzo said without looking at her, returning his attention to the documents on his desk. Basia nodded quickly, keeping her head bowed. She shuffled toward the towering bookshelves that lined the far wall. She was acutely aware of how much space she took up in the room, constantly trying to shrink herself, an impossible task for a woman of her size. She awkwardly reached up with her left hand, dragging the feather duster across the leather-bound spines. Her right arm hung uselessly at her side, tucked deep into the folds of her apron. The pain was becoming unbearable. The adrenaline that had gotten her through the morning commute was fading, replaced by a sickening, nauseating wave of agony. The room felt uncomfortably hot. Black spots began to dance in the corners of her vision. She moved to the side table to collect a tray of empty espresso cups left over from Lorenzo's earlier meeting. She reached out with her good left hand, but the heavy silver tray was unbalanced. Instinctively, without thinking, Basia brought her broken right arm up to support the opposite side of the tray. The moment the weight of the silver and porcelain pressed against her shattered forearm, her vision whited out completely. A strangled, agonizing gasp tore from her throat. The silver tray slipped from her trembling fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. Delicate espresso cups shattered into 100 pieces, scattering across the priceless antique rug. Basia collapsed to her knees, clutching her right arm to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The pain was so absolute, so blinding, that she completely forgot where she was. She rocked back and forth on the floor, her heavy frame shuddering as tears streamed down her flushed, round cheeks. Silence descended upon the room, heavier than lead. Matteo stopped pacing, his hand instinctively dropping to the holster beneath his suit jacket. But Lorenzo didn't flinch. He slowly laid his cigar in the crystal ashtray and stood up. The massive chair scraped against the floor. I am so sorry, Basia choked out, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. She tried to scramble backward, clumsily using her left hand to sweep up the broken porcelain, cutting her palm in the process. I'll clean it. I'll pay for the cups. Please, Mr. Costa, don't fire me. Please. Lorenzo walked around the desk. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely, unnervingly focused. He towered over her, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow her whole. Stop moving, Basia, Lorenzo commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was a quiet, authoritative rumble that demanded immediate obedience. Basia froze, terrified, still clutching her arm. Matteo, step outside, Lorenzo ordered, without taking his eyes off the maid. Boss? Outside. Now. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Basia alone with the most dangerous man in the city. Lorenzo slowly knelt on the floor, ignoring the shards of porcelain. For the first time in the 3 years she had worked there, he was looking directly into her face. He didn't look at her with the pity, disgust, or dismissiveness she was so accustomed to receiving from men. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was suddenly compelled to solve. Show me your arm, he said softly. It's nothing, sir, just a sprain. I slipped on the ice. Do not lie to me in my own home, Lorenzo interrupted, his tone chillingly calm. Show it to me. Now. Trembling violently, Basia slowly pulled her right arm out from the protective folds of her apron. She rolled up the oversized black cotton sleeve. Lorenzo's breath hitched slightly, an imperceptible reaction that only a trained killer would notice. The flesh of her forearm was swollen to twice its normal size, a grotesque, bulbous mass of midnight blue, black, and angry red. In the center of the swelling, the skin was pushed up into a harsh, unnatural peak, where the splintered bone was resting millimeters beneath the surface, threatening to break through. It was one of the most brutal breaks he had ever seen. Lorenzo reached out, his large, calloused hands remarkably gentle as he lightly gripped her wrist to support the weight of her arm. Basia flinched, letting out a sharp cry, but he held her steady. This is not a slip on the ice, Lorenzo stated, his steel eyes rising to meet her terrified, tear-filled gaze. This is a blunt force trauma. Someone hit you with a pipe or a bat. Basia squeezed her eyes shut, fat tears rolling down her cheeks, a sob catching in her chest. She was going to lose her job. She was a liability. Who did this? Lorenzo asked, the temperature in the room dropping 10 degrees. Nobody, she wept, shaking her head. Please, sir, let me go back to work. I can clean with one hand. I need this job. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He looked at the broken, trembling woman, kneeling in front of him. She was an employee, yes, but more than that. She was under his roof. She was a part of his household. In Lorenzo's archaic, twisted moral code, whatever was his was under his absolute protection. Someone had put their hands on a woman who worked for him. "You are not going back to work," Lorenzo said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and gently pressing it against the bleeding cut on her left palm. "You are going to sit on that sofa, and you are going to tell me exactly who thought they could lay a finger on someone who belongs to the Costa estate." Barcia sat stiffly on the edge of the plush leather Chesterfield sofa in Lorenzo's study, terrified of ruining the expensive upholstery with her sweat and the grime of the city. Lorenzo stood by the massive bay window, staring out at the rain-slicked grounds of the estate, a heavy glass of amber whiskey in his hand. The door opened, and Dr. Aris Keller, the syndicate's private underground surgeon, hurried into the room carrying a black medical bag. He was a discreet man who usually dealt with gunshot wounds and knife lacerations, not the domestic staff. "Fix her," Lorenzo said, not turning away from the window. "Whatever she needs, do it here." Dr. Keller approached Barcia with professional detachment, though his eyes widened slightly when he examined the arm. "Miss, I'm going to have to set this bone before I cast it. It is going to hurt," he murmured, preparing a syringe of local anesthetic. Barcia bit her lip, nodding quickly. She was terrified of the doctor, but even more terrified of the imposing silence radiating from Lorenzo. As the doctor worked, injecting the numbing agent and carefully manipulating the fractured bone, Barcia let out a muffled shriek, burying her face into her good shoulder. Lorenzo turned from the window. He walked over, bypassing the doctor entirely, and crouched in front of Barcia. He placed his large, warm hand over her uninjured knee, grounding her. It was an incredibly intimate, startlingly tender gesture from a man known to carve his enemies to pieces. "Look at me, Barcia," Lorenzo said quietly. She forced her eyes open, meeting his intense stare. "Focus on my voice. Tell me the story. Now." The pain, the medication, and the overwhelming presence of the Mafia boss broke the last of her defenses. The words spilled out of her in a rush of tears and shame. "It was my brother, Tommy," she sobbed, gasping as Dr. Keller snapped the bone back into alignment. "He owes money, a lot of it. 60,000. I was walking home. They were in the alley. 15 of them. They surrounded me." Lorenzo's hand tightened slightly on her knee. 15 men surrounded one woman in an alley, he clarified, his voice dropping into a deadly, soft register. Barcia nodded, tears flowing freely. They pinned me against the dumpsters. They laughed. They called me names. About my size. They said Tommy had until the end of the week, or next time they'd break my legs. Then a man named Mickey took a tire iron. She choked on a sob, unable to finish the sentence, as the memory of the cracking bone flashed in her mind. "Mickey," Lorenzo repeated. "Did they name who they work for?" "Jimmy O'Shea," she whispered, instantly regretting it. "Please, Mr. Costa, don't say anything to the police. They'll kill Tommy. They'll come back for me." Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. He stood up slowly, towering over the room. The air around him seemed to crackle with an unseen, terrifying voltage. He looked down at Barcia, who was sweating and panting as Dr. Keller began wrapping her arm in a rigid fiberglass cast. She looked so vulnerable, so entirely discarded by the world, It ignited a possessive, blinding fury in Lorenzo's chest that he hadn't felt in a decade. Jimmy O'Shea, the West Side Cobras, the disorganized, doppy crew Matteo had just been complaining about. They weren't just stepping on Lorenzo's toes by shaking down businesses in his city. They had ambushed his maid. 15 armed men had beaten an overweight, unarmed woman with a tire iron for a petty 60 grand debt. It was an insult to his city. It was an insult to his territory. Most importantly, it was an insult to him. "There will be no police, Basia," Lorenzo said smoothly, his eyes devoid of any human warmth as he stared at the wall behind her. "You are going to stay here tonight. I will have a guest room prepared for you on the ground floor, so you do not have to use the stairs. Dr. Keller will leave you pain medication." "Mr. Costa, I can't stay in a guest room. I'm staff." "You are going to do exactly as I say," Lorenzo interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He softened his voice slightly. "You are safe here. Nobody will ever touch you again. I give you my word." Lorenzo turned and walked out of the study, leaving the door open. He strode down the long corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing off the marble. He found Matteo in the main foyer, arguing with one of the capos on a burner phone. Matteo hung up as Lorenzo approached. "Boss, what's the situation?" "Call the cleaners," Lorenzo said, his voice eerily calm, the calm of a hurricane's eye. "Call the mechanics, call the sweepers. Bring everyone in. I want the entire Eastern crew mobilized." Matteo's eyes widened in shock. "Everyone? Boss, that's over 100 armed men. Are we going to war with the Russians?" "No," Lorenzo said, stopping at the front doors and staring out into the driving rain. "We are going hunting." "For who?" "Jimmy O'Shea," Lorenzo replied, turning his head slowly to look at his second-in-command. "And the 14 men who walk with him. I want the city locked down. No one gets out on a train. No one leaves on a boat. No one crosses the bridges." Matteo swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the order. "Boss, if we hit O'Shea's whole crew in one night, it's going to make a lot of noise. The feds will be all over it by morning. It's a massive risk." "For what? Did they hit one of our shipments?" Lorenzo stepped into Matteo's personal space, the sheer predatory aura of the man forcing Matteo to take a half-step back. "They touched something that belongs to me," Lorenzo whispered, his eyes flashing with a violent, demonic light. "I want all 15 of them found. I want them brought to the meat-packing plant in Brooklyn. Alive." "Do you understand me, Matteo?" "Yes, boss." "Good." Lorenzo adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit. "Because by morning, Jimmy O'Shea and his entire crew are going to be nothing but a myth." As Matteo scrambled to make the calls that would unleash hell upon the city, Lorenzo walked back toward his study to check on the fat, quiet woman who had unwittingly brought the entire Mafia syndicate to its knees for her vengeance. The night had just begun, and there was a lot of blood to spill before sunrise. The storm that battered New York City that night was biblical, a relentless deluge that flooded the gutters and obscured the neon lights of the skyline. But beneath the cover of thunder and torrential rain, a different kind of storm was raging through the boroughs. It was a silent, meticulously coordinated strike, orchestrated by a network of phantoms moving with terrifying precision. Lorenzo Costa's syndicate did not operate like a street gang. They were a paramilitary organization, fueled by limitless wealth and bound by a code of absolute loyalty. Within 2 hours of Lorenzo's command, black SUVs began rolling through the slick, rain-washed streets of Queens and Brooklyn. At a dive bar in Astoria, 3 of Jimmy O'Shea's enforcers were drinking heavily, celebrating their recent shakedowns. They never saw the men in tailored black coats slip through the back exit. A heavy hand over a mouth, the cold prick of a sedative, and they were dragged out through the kitchen before the bartender even noticed they had left without paying their tab. In a low-rent apartment building in Flushing, 5 more of the West Side Cobras were playing poker when their steel-reinforced door was kicked completely off its hinges. Before a single gun could be drawn, laser sights painted their chests. They were zip-tied, gagged, and hauled down the fire escape like sacks of grain. Matteo Ricci sat in the back of a luxury town car, parked beneath the dripping overpass of the BQE, a tablet glowing in his lap. One by one, names were crossed off the digital list. There was no gunfire. There were no messy brawls that would draw the attention of the NYPD. Lorenzo's men were professionals, sweeping the 15 thugs up like dust off a polished floor. While the underworld was systematically violently reorganized, Baysire Hughes was experiencing a bizarre, disorienting reality back at the sprawling Costa estate. She was sitting on the edge of a massive 4-poster bed in a ground-floor guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The walls were covered in pale silk wallpaper, and the bathroom attached to it was entirely rendered in white marble. The head housekeeper, an austere woman named Mrs. Gable, who usually treated Barcia like an annoyance, had personally drawn her a hot bath, covered her cast with a waterproof bag, and left a set of incredibly soft, oversized cashmere pajamas on the bed. Barcia wore them now, the dark blue fabric pooling comfortably around her large frame. For the first time in her life, she wasn't squeezing into clothes that pinched or pulled, but the luxury of her surroundings only made her feel more like an imposter. She clutched her heavy, fiberglass-encased arm against her chest, her mind racing with panic. She had just painted a target on Tommy's back. By telling Lorenzo Costa about Jimmy O'Shea, she had undoubtedly sparked a turf war. Tommy was a fool, a degenerate gambler, but he was her blood. She couldn't stomach the thought of him ending up in the river because of her broken arm. A soft knock on the heavy oak door made her jump. Before she could answer, the door pushed open, and Lorenzo Costa stepped into the room. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. The top buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of the dark tattoos sprawling across his collarbone. He carried a small silver tray, holding a steaming mug of tea and a plate of warm buttered toast. The sheer domesticity of the act, performed by a man who ruled a criminal empire, left Barcia entirely speechless. "Dr. Keller said you need to eat before taking the pain medication," Lorenzo said, his deep voice filling the quiet room. He walked over, setting the tray on the nightstand, and pulled a velvet armchair closer to the bed, sitting down facing her. "You didn't have to do this, Mr. Costa," Barcia stammered, her cheeks burning hot with shame. She instinctively tried to cross her arms to hide her stomach, a nervous habit, but the heavy cast prevented it. I can have Sophia bring me something, or I can go to the kitchen." "You are not going to the kitchen, Barcia," Lorenzo said, his eyes locking onto hers. "And you will call me Lorenzo. Understood?" She swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir." "Lorenzo." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. He looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't look at her double chin or the wide breadth of her hips. He looked directly into her eyes, searching for something. "You are worried about your brother," Lorenzo stated. It wasn't a question. Tears immediately welled in Barcia's eyes. "Tommy is an idiot," she whispered, her voice cracking. He makes terrible choices, but he's the only family I have left. If O'Shea thinks Tommy sent you after him, they'll kill him, Lorenzo. I shouldn't have said anything. I should have just borne it." A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Lorenzo's face. "You will never bear anything like that again," he said softly, yet the words carried the weight of an iron vault. "As for your brother, Tommy's debt of $60,000 has been cleared." Basia's jaw dropped. She stared at him, her mind failing to process the information. "Cleared? How?" "I bought his debt from O'Shea's bookie an hour ago," Lorenzo explained calmly. "He no longer owes the West Side Cobras a dime. He owes me. And because you are an employee of this house, I consider the debt forgiven. I have also had 2 of my men locate Tommy at his apartment. They have put him on a train to Chicago with $10,000 in cash and a clean slate. He will not be returning to New York." Basia let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her good hand. The crushing weight of the debt, the constant fear of the men in the shadows, it was just gone, erased by a single command from the man sitting in front of her. "Why?" she sobbed, completely bewildered. "Why would you do this for me? I'm nobody. I'm just the fat maid who cleans the baseboards. I'm nothing to you." Lorenzo stood up abruptly. The sudden movement made Basia flinch, but he didn't reach for her. He simply stood over the bed, his jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Never speak about yourself like that in my presence again," Lorenzo ordered, his voice vibrating with a quiet, fierce anger. "You are not invisible. You are not a ghost haunting these halls. You are loyal, you are hard-working, and you are mine." He paused, letting the heavy, possessive word hang in the air between them. The syndicate boss, a man who possessed millions of dollars in art, real estate, and businesses, had just claimed a broken, overweight maid as his own. "When you work for me, you are under my protection," Lorenzo continued, his voice softening just a fraction as he looked down at her tear-streaked face. "O'Shea and his men made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at you and saw a target. I look at you and see a woman who belongs in my house. Eat your toast, Basia. Take your medicine. Sleep." He turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Basia asked, her voice small, suddenly terrified of him leaving the room. Lorenzo paused in the doorway, the hallway light casting half his face in deep shadow. His eyes were cold, hollow. The eyes of the predator she had heard rumors about in the staff locker room. "I have an appointment in Brooklyn," Lorenzo said smoothly. "I have to teach some dogs how to heal." The meat-packing plant in the industrial heart of Brooklyn had been abandoned for 5 years, ostensibly purchased by a holding company to be turned into luxury lofts. In reality, it was Lorenzo Costa's private theater. The air inside was frigid, smelling faintly of old copper, frost, and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed angrily overhead, casting a sickly pale yellow glow over the massive main floor. Heavy steel meat hooks dangled from motorized tracks on the ceiling, swaying gently in the drafts that sneaked through the cracked windows. 15 men were on the floor. They were bound to heavy steel folding chairs with thick, industrial zip ties, arranged in a wide semicircle. Their faces were bruised, their clothes torn, and the collective stench of their panic was palpable in the freezing air. Jimmy O'Shea, a barrel-chested man with a broken nose and a cheap leather jacket, was sitting in the center. Next to him was Mickey, the towering brute who had wielded the tire iron. Surrounding them were 40 of Lorenzo Costa's elite soldiers, armed with suppressed submachine guns, their faces completely impassive. "What the hell is this, Ricci?" Jimmy O'Shea screamed, thrashing against his restraints, spitting blood onto the concrete. He glared at Matteo, who was standing a few feet away, checking his gold Rolex. "We have a truce. The Cobras haven't touched a single one of Costa's shipments. You can't just snatch us off the street. The Commission will hear about this." Matteo didn't even look up from his watch. "The Commission only cares about men who generate revenue, Jimmy. You run a glorified street gang. You're a rounding error." The heavy steel doors at the far end of the warehouse groaned open. The rhythmic, echoing sound of hard leather shoes against concrete filled the cavernous room. The 40 armed guards immediately straightened, lowering their heads in a silent show of absolute deference. Lorenzo Costa walked into the light. He had put his suit jacket back on, looking immaculate, a terrifying contrast to the bloodied, panicked thugs strapped to the chairs. He walked slowly, unhurriedly, a lit cigar pinched between his fingers. He stopped a few feet in front of Jimmy O'Shea, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. O'Shea swallowed hard, his bluster instantly evaporating in the presence of the Don. "Lorenzo, Mr. Costa," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I swear to God, whatever you think we did, there's been a mistake. We didn't touch your docks. We didn't mess with your unions. Just tell me what this is about, and I'll make it right. Double the compensation, whatever you want." Lorenzo looked at the man with absolute disgust. He slowly paced the length of the semicircle, his cold steel eyes analyzing each of the 15 men. He stopped in front of Mickey, noting the fresh blood on the knuckles of his right hand. "You owe me a silver tray," Lorenzo said, his voice echoing softly off the concrete walls. O'Shea blinked, utterly confused. A silver tray? What? And a set of antique espresso cups," Lorenzo continued, turning back to face O'Shea. "Priceless, really. 18th century porcelain, hand-painted in Florence." "Lorenzo, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about," O'Shea pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "We don't steal antiques. We run numbers. We do low-level extortion." "I know exactly what you do, Jimmy," Lorenzo said, stopping in the center of the room. He took a slow drag from his cigar. "You shake down desperate people. You prey on the weak. You target those you believe have no voice, no power, and no protection. Yesterday evening, in an alley in Queens, 15 of you surrounded a woman. Mickey, the brute, suddenly went completely still. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as the pieces fell into place. "You surrounded a woman who owes you nothing," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping into a register so dark, so steeped in violence, that even his own men shifted uneasily. "You mocked her, you humiliated her, and then you shattered her arm with a tire iron to send a message to a man who couldn't pay his debts. O'Shea stammered, looking at Mickey, then back at Lorenzo. "The fat chick? Tommy Hughes's sister. Wait, Lorenzo, she's a nobody. She cleans toilets. How could you possibly care about a nobody maid?" It was the wrong thing to say. Lorenzo moved faster than a man in a tailored suit had any right to move. He crossed the distance between them in a split second, wrapping his large hand around O'Shea's throat and slamming the back of the man's head against the steel chair. The heavy thud echoed through the warehouse. Lorenzo's eyes were wild, the mask of the sophisticated businessman entirely ripped away, revealing the apex predator underneath. "She is my employee," Lorenzo snarled, leaning in so close that O'Shea could smell the expensive cologne and tobacco on his skin. "She is under my roof. She breathes the air in my home. That makes her mine. And nobody touches what is mine and lives to see the sunrise. Lorenzo released O'Shea's throat, letting the man gasp and wheeze for air. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped his hand, as if O'Shea's skin had soiled him. "Please," Mickey begged, tears streaming down his bruised face. He was staring at the heavy steel meat hooks hanging above them. "Please, Mr. Costa, we didn't know. We swear to God, we didn't know she worked for you." "Ignorance is not an excuse for touching my property," Lorenzo replied coldly. He dropped the soiled handkerchief onto the concrete floor. He turned his back on the 15 men and began to walk toward the exit. The air in the room seemed to freeze completely. The absolute finality in his posture sent a wave of hysterical panic through the tied-up men. "Wait, Lorenzo, wait! You can't just kill 15 Maid men over a broken arm!" O'Shea screamed, thrashing wildly, tipping his chair over onto the floor. "The Commission will go to war with you. You'll lose the city." Lorenzo paused at the heavy steel doors. He looked over his shoulder, his expression devoid of anything remotely human. "Let them try," Lorenzo said softly. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the pouring rain. As the heavy steel clicked shut behind him, the deafening sound of 40 suppressed submachine guns raising in unison filled the warehouse. By dawn, the West Side Cobras would cease to exist. The 15 men who had laughed at Bezier Hughes in the alley would be nothing more than ash scattered in the East River. Lorenzo climbed into the back of his waiting town car, tapping the glass divider. "Take me home," he ordered the driver. He leaned his head back against the leather seat, closing his eyes as the car sped through the flooded streets of Brooklyn. The blood had been paid. The scale was balanced. Now he had to return to his estate. He had a broken bird in a gilded cage to tend to, and Lorenzo Costa was a man who intended to keep what belonged to him forever. Morning sunlight filtered through the sheer silk curtains of the ground-floor suite, casting a warm, golden hue across the massive four-poster bed. Bezier Hughes woke with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs as the events of the previous day rushed back in a violent wave of memory. The alley, the tire iron, the sickening snap of her bone. And then Lorenzo Costa, the most feared Mafia don on the eastern seaboard, kneeling before her on his antique rug, treating her like something precious. She looked down at her right arm, now encased in a heavy, pristine white fiberglass cast. The throbbing pain had dulled to a deep, persistent ache, thanks to the potent painkillers Dr. Keller had left on the nightstand. She pushed herself up awkwardly with her left hand, the luxurious cashmere pajamas slipping slightly off her wide, heavy shoulders. She swung her thick legs over the side of the mattress, her bare feet sinking into the plush wool carpet. A sleek, flat-screen television was mounted on the opposite wall. Searching for some semblance of normalcy, Bezier fumbled with the silver remote control and turned it on, leaving the volume low. The local morning news flickered to life. Anchor David Novak, a staple of New York's morning broadcasts, stared gravely into the camera. A baffling development in Queens this morning. The NYPD is actively investigating the sudden mass disappearance of 15 known associates of a local organized crime syndicate. Authorities found multiple abandoned properties in Flushing and Astoria with signs of forced entry, but no bodies, no blood, and no witnesses. FBI Special Agent Richard Sullivan has officially taken over the Joint Task Force, citing a potential mob war. Bezier's blood ran completely cold. The remote slipped from her fingers, tumbling softly onto the carpet. 15 men, Jimmy O'Shea's entire crew. They were gone, wiped off the face of the earth in a single night. The heavy oak door unlatched with a quiet click. Basia jumped, instinctively pulling the cashmere blanket up over her large stomach. Lorenzo Costa walked into the room. He was still wearing the same tailored suit from the night before, though he had discarded the tie. The faint metallic scent of cold rain and burnt tobacco clung to him. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his steel eyes darker, his jaw tense. He paused near the doorway, his gaze immediately darting to the television screen behind her. He picked up the remote from the floor and clicked the television off, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. "You're awake," Lorenzo said softly, his deep voice carrying a rough, gravelly edge. Basia was trembling so hard, her teeth chattered. "The news," she whispered, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Lorenzo, the news just said 15 men are missing. Jimmy O'Shea's men." "They are not missing, Basia," Lorenzo replied, walking slowly towards the bed. "They are exactly where I put them." She let out a choked, terrified sob, pressing her good hand against her mouth. "You killed them, all of them, because of me." "I eradicated a disease that infected my city," Lorenzo corrected, pulling up the velvet armchair and sitting down heavily. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I removed a crew of cowards who thought they could operate in my shadow and touch what is mine. You were merely the catalyst." "But I'm just a maid," she cried out, the sheer absurdity of the situation breaking her composure. "I'm nobody. Look at me, Lorenzo. I'm fat, I'm clumsy, I broke your antique porcelain, and I scrub your floors. Men don't go to war for women like me. They don't do this." Lorenzo's eyes darkened, a dangerous, possessive fire igniting in his irises. He reached out, his large, warm hand gripping her left wrist, pulling her gently but firmly toward him until she was forced to meet his gaze. "I told you last night to never speak of yourself that way again," he warned, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "Society may have taught you that your size makes you invisible. They taught you to shrink, to hide in oversized uniforms and apologize for the space you occupy. But I am not society, Basia. When I look at you, I do not see a maid. I see a woman of substance. I see loyalty. I see a woman who walked into my study with a shattered bone and tried to clean my shelves because she valued her duty over her own agony." He reached up, his calloused thumb gently brushing away a tear that had fallen onto her round, flushed cheek. "I own politicians, judges, and police commissioners. I have wealth that spans continents. But true, unbroken loyalty? That is rare. You belong here, not as staff, as mine." "I don't understand," she breathed, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. "You are no longer a maid in this house," Lorenzo stated, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "You are not to lift a finger to clean, cook, or serve. Mrs. Gable has been informed. Sophia has been informed. You will remain in this suite until your arm is fully healed. I have called a private tailor from Manhattan. She will arrive at noon to measure you for a new wardrobe, clothes that actually fit you, clothes that command respect." Basia shook her head wildly, overwhelmed. "Lorenzo, no. The other staff. Matteo. They will think I manipulated you. They will hate me." At the mention of his underboss, a flicker of ice crossed Lorenzo's face. "Matteo Ricci answers to me. The staff answers to me. And now they answer to you. Anyone who shows you a shred of disrespect will be removed from this estate permanently." He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the bed. "Rest, Basia. The tailor will be here soon. And do not worry about the FBI or Agent Sullivan. They will find nothing but dead ends and ghosts." As Lorenzo walked out, locking the door behind him, Basia sank back into the pillows. The world as she knew it had been completely incinerated. She was no longer the invisible, fat woman from Queens. She was the protected obsession of a monster, trapped in a beautiful, terrifying, gilded cage. 6 weeks passed in a blur of surreal luxury and suffocating tension. The brutal winter thawed into a damp, grey spring. Basia's broken arm had healed significantly, the heavy fiberglass cast replaced by a sleek, black medical brace. True to Lorenzo's word, her life had transformed entirely. The private tailor had designed a wardrobe that embraced her large frame rather than hiding it. Elegant silk blouses, structured wool trousers, and beautiful flowing dresses that made her feel a strange, alien sense of beauty. She dined with Lorenzo in the evenings, engaging in quiet, intense conversations, where the Mafia Don would listen to her with an unwavering, terrifying focus. He treated her as an equal, a confidant, the grounding anchor to his violent life. But not everyone in the Costa Syndicate accepted the new world order. Matteo Ricci, Lorenzo's ruthless second-in-command, had been quietly seething for a month and a half. The massacre of the West Side Cobras had drawn intense federal scrutiny. Lorenzo's businesses were being audited, his shipments at the docks were being delayed by customs, and the syndicate was bleeding money, all because of a fat domestic worker. In Matteo's eyes, Lorenzo had lost his mind. The Don had gone soft, compromised by a bizarre obsession. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Lorenzo was in Manhattan, meeting with his high-priced defense attorneys to quash a federal subpoena. The estate was unusually quiet, the rain drumming softly against the towering bay windows of the library. Basia was sitting by the fireplace, reading a novel, wearing a deep emerald green dress that complemented her dark hair. She felt a chill creep up her spine before she even heard the footsteps. Matteo walked into the library, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind him. He looked different today, feverish, desperate, his usually immaculate suit slightly wrinkled. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a suppressed 9mm Beretta, letting it hang casually by his side. Basia froze, the book slipping from her lap. "Matteo, what are you doing?" "Fixing a massive mistake," Matteo sneered, stepping closer. His eyes raked over her with unrestrained disgust. "Look at you, wearing Prada, sitting by the fire like you're the lady of the manor. You're a joke, Basia. You're a maid who got lucky because the boss had a momentary lapse in sanity." Basia slowly stood up, her heart hammering wildly. She kept her left hand near her braced right arm, her mind racing. "Lorenzo will kill you for this," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, refusing to cower. "Lorenzo is blinded by you," Matteo spat, raising the gun and pointing it directly at her chest. 15 men. He killed 15 Maid men in one night for a fat, useless pig who scrubs toilets. The FBI is crawling all over our docks. We lost 3 shipments this week alone. The commission is demanding answers. I'm going to give them one. I'm going to tell them that the distraction has been eliminated. "You think killing me will solve your problems?" Basia challenged, taking a slow step to her right, putting the heavy leather armchair between them. The old Basia would have wept. The old Basia would have begged for her life. But spending 6 weeks in the shadow of Lorenzo Costa had changed her. She had absorbed his steel. "It will snap him out of it," Matteo said, his finger tightening on the trigger. He'll mourn, and then he'll get back to business. Nothing personal, Bay." Before Matteo could pull the trigger, the heavy mahogany doors of the library violently shattered inward. Splinters of antique wood rained across the Persian rug as Lorenzo Costa kicked the locked doors entirely off their brass hinges. He didn't look like a sophisticated businessman. He looked like the devil himself, his eyes blazing with a murderous, unhinged fury. Matteo spun around, startled by the explosion of wood, his gun wavering for a fraction of a second. That was all Lorenzo needed. He moved with terrifying speed, drawing a heavy .45 caliber pistol from his shoulder holster and firing a single deafening shot before Matteo could even aim. The bullet struck Matteo in the right shoulder, spinning the underboss around and sending his suppressed Beretta clattering across the hardwood floor. Matteo screamed, collapsing to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Lorenzo didn't stop. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Matteo by the throat and slamming him violently against the stone mantel of the fireplace. "Boss! Boss, wait!" Matteo choked out, coughing up blood. "She's ruining you! The feds—" "You drew a weapon on the woman who holds my heart," Lorenzo whispered, his voice completely devoid of mercy. He pressed the hot barrel of the .45 directly beneath Matteo's chin. "You are nothing but a traitor." "Lorenzo, please," Matteo begged, tears streaming down his face. Without breaking eye contact with his former second-in-command, Lorenzo pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the library. Matteo's body went completely limp, sliding down the stone mantel and collapsing into a lifeless heap on the floor. The ringing in Basia's ears was overwhelming. She stood frozen, staring at the blood pooling on the expensive rug. The violence was absolute, horrific, and yet it was done entirely to protect her. Lorenzo slowly holstered his weapon. He didn't look at the body. He turned to Basia, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning her frantically for any sign of injury. He crossed the room, stepping over the blood, and pulled her into his arms. Basia gasped, burying her face into his chest, her large frame shaking violently against his solid warmth. Lorenzo wrapped his arms around her wide back, holding her as if she were the only tether, keeping him from spinning off the edge of the earth. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling her scent. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "Did he touch you?" "No," Basia sobbed, gripping the lapels of his suit. "No, I'm okay. But Lorenzo, he was right. I am ruining your business. The FBI, the money. I'm a liability." Lorenzo pulled back just enough to frame her round, tear-stained face with his large hands. His steel eyes were fierce, burning with a devotion that bordered on religious worship. "Let the FBI come," Lorenzo vowed, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Let the Commission declare war. I will burn this entire city to the ground. I will bankrupt my Ehor, and I will salt the earth before I let anyone take you from me. You are not a liability, Basia. You are my queen. And a king does not apologize for slaughtering those who threaten his throne." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was a claiming, a deep, bruised and desperate collision of souls. Basia kissed him back, pouring all her fear, all her years of invisibility, and all her newfound power into him. She felt the heavy medical brace on her arm press against his chest, a stark reminder of the night she had been broken, only to be reforged in the fires of the underworld. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Lorenzo looked down at the dead man on the floor. "I need to call the cleaners," Lorenzo said quietly, pulling Basia tightly against his side. "No," Basia said, surprising herself. She looked up at the terrifying Mafia Don, her chin lifted, her dark eyes flashing with a new, dangerous light. "Call your capos, all of them. Have them come to the estate tonight. If they are going to answer to me now, they need to see exactly what happens to men who point guns at the lady of the house." Lorenzo stared at her for a long moment, a slow, wicked smile spreading across his face. The fat, quiet maid from Queens was dead. In her place stood a woman who fully understood the power of the shadows, and who was finally ready to rule them. "As you wish, Mia Regina," Lorenzo murmured. By midnight, the hierarchy of the New York underworld was rewritten. The men in the shadows bowed not just to Lorenzo Costa, but to the formidable, unbreakable woman by his side. Basia Hughes was no longer invisible. She was the most dangerous woman in the city, and heaven help anyone who forgot it. Are you utterly hooked by this dark, intense mafia romance? Did Basia's incredible transformation from an invisible maid to a fearless, powerful underworld queen leave you breathless? If you loved the drama, the undeniable tension, and the absolute destruction Lorenzo rained down on his enemies for the woman he loves, then do not miss out on more. Hit that like button right now. Share this thrilling story with all your friends who love dark romance, and absolutely subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding, unforgettable stories. Drop a comment below and tell us your favorite scene.